Hello everyone, welcome to our lecture series for chapter 23 in your textbook Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This chapter is entitled The United States and the Cold War, 1945 to 1953. The first section of this lecture series is entitled The Origins of the Cold War. The focus question for this section is what series of events and ideological conflicts prompted the Cold War? The United States emerged from World War II as the world's greatest power, a superpower, if you will. And based on their experiences from both World War I and World War II, American leaders believed that American security rested on the security of Europe and Asia, and that American prosperity in general required a global economic reconstruction, of course, led by American business interest. American dominance could only be challenged by the Soviet Union, the only other power to emerge from this time in a stronger position than it had prior to the war, and was really the only power that could be considered a superpower on par with the United States. But of course the Soviet Union had its own post-war vision that was shaped by its socialist communist values that stood in direct opposition to the Republican, democratic, capitalist values of the United States and its allies. There is an old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and this was certainly the case when it came to the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II. Both viewed Nazi Germany as an existential threat, and despite the fact that politically and ideologically the US and the USSR were diametrically opposed to each other, the threat of Nazi Germany was paramount, and this allowed both sides to lay aside their differences and ally together in efforts to eliminate the threat of Nazi Germany. However, once that threat had been eliminated, that wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly deteriorated. Shortly after the conclusion of the war, U.S. diplomat George Kennan issued what became known as the Long Telegram, which argued that communism was an expansionist ideology, and this telegram laid the foundation for the policy of containment, which was basically a U.S. policy that said that communism needed to be contained where it currently existed and not allowed to spread any further, as communism was a direct threat to the Republican capitalist principles of the United States and its allies. Based on this policy of containment, the Iron Curtain settled across the European continent, and which partitioned Europe between the free West and the communist East. And the Truman Doctrine emerged at this time, which embraced the Cold War and described it as a worldwide struggle over the future of freedom itself. Truman quickly put the policy of containment into effect in Greece and Turkey, as the United States established a military presence in both countries, which hoped to serve as a preventative barrier against any possible incursions by the Soviet Union. Truman declared that the U.S. must be responsible for supporting freedom-loving peoples wherever communism threatened them. And at its core, the Cold War was very much an ideological conflict. Which one of the two dominant political economic principles that existed in the world would come out on top and reign supreme? Republican capitalism or communism? The U.S. provided assistance to anti-communist regimes, no matter how undemocratic they were, and created a global military alliance against the USSR. One of the first things on the U.S. agenda after the war was the rebuilding and reconstruction of a devastated European continent. This was seen as necessary to provide a stable economic and political paradigm which could prevent future tensions and future conflicts. To this goal, the United States established what became known as the Marshall Plan, which was authored by the United States Secretary of State George C. Marshall. In this plan, the United States pledged to contribute billions of dollars to finance the economic recovery of Europe. Economic and political instability was seen as a potential breeding ground for communism and communist influence. This can be seen as a new deal, if you will, for Europe that was incredibly successful in actually rebuilding the European continent, of course, particularly Western Europe, and reinvigorating the European economy. But it further solidified the division of Europe into U.S. and Soviet spheres of influence. Similar events to the Marshall Plan in Europe were taking place on the other side of the globe when it came to the United States' involvement with Japan after World War II. The United States military occupied Japan until 1948 and forced Japan to adopt a new democratic constitution and land redistribution. It forced Japan to renounce the policy of war and armed aggression. They actually dismantled the Japanese military and did not allow Japan to reform a military for decades to come. The United States put forth billions of dollars in economic recovery and rebuilt Japan's industrial base at a very rapid pace. The United States believed that a strong capitalist Japan could check the spread of communism in Asia, which was already showing signs of spreading with the Maoist revolution in China. The situation in Germany at the close of the war was a very interesting one, and the four victorious powers, the Allied powers, divided Germany and Berlin into four separate zones of influence: an American, British, French, and Soviet zone. Cold War tensions between capitalist United States, France, and Germany, and communist Soviet Union quickly escalated, and there was a concern among the Soviet Union that the ability of the capitalist regimes to have some sort of influence in Berlin in particular, which was the capital of Germany, which was deep in the Soviet zone of influence, led the Soviets to cut off all road and rail traffic into and out of Berlin. And this led to what was known as the Berlin Airlift, as the Allied powers, led by the United States, airlifted supplies, including, of course, necessary food, into Berlin to help alleviate the suffering of the citizens of Berlin, who were cut off from access to many of the necessities that they were used to because of the Soviet domination of their territory. And the success of the Berlin Airlift was a major propaganda victory for the United States, and of course was widely publicized and cast the United States as heroes saving a suffering people in Berlin. This airlift led to the creation of East and West Germany. East Germany, of course, being within that Soviet sphere of influence. West Germany being within the capitalist sphere of influence of the United States, Britain, and France, and also divided the city of Berlin itself. Although the city of Berlin was firmly within the territory of East Germany, the boundaries within the city itself was also divided into four separate zones of influence, which of course led to a very complicated political position between all of these powers over the issue of Berlin. Also, at the conclusion of the war, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed, NATO, which promised mutual defense against any future Soviet attack. The map you see here illustrates the geopolitical situation in Europe at the conclusion of World War II and the onset of the Cold War. These countries you see in green were part of the NATO powers, the capitalist powers that stood in opposition to the communist influence of the Soviet Union. What you see here in the sort of orangish color is the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union and what would later be called the Warsaw Pact, which was an organization of countries that were allied with the Soviet Union that stood in opposition to the NATO countries. Also, you see here a small map of the city of Berlin itself, and as you see, that city was also divided into separate zones of influence. West Berlin being part of the capitalist zone with, of course, American, French, and British zones of influence there, and East Berlin that fell within the communist Soviet zone of influence. And of course, that red line you see running through the middle was where the Berlin Wall was eventually built, which firmly separated these two halves of Berlin for decades. Cold War tensions escalated at the close of the 1940s with what was seen as a growing communist challenge emerging from both the Soviet Union and a new communist power, China. Mao Zedong was victorious in creating the People's Republic of China, a new communist state in 1949. And Mao's success suggested that communism was indeed spreading, which was one of the primary concerns of the NATO powers at this time. 1949 also saw the Soviets successfully test their own nuclear bomb, which of course dramatically raised the stakes of the Cold War. In 1950, the National Security Council drafted what became known as NSC 68, a policy paper which called for the permanent military buildup through a dramatic increase in American military spending to counteract this growing communist challenge. Germany was not the only country that was divided into separate spheres of influence at the conclusion of World War II. Korea also saw this phenomenon manifest itself, and Korea was divided into American and Soviet zones, a communist North Korea and an anti-communist South Korea. And Korea quickly became a powder keg for Cold War tensions, as in June 1950, North Korea invaded the South, seeking to unite Korea under a communist regime, an obvious attempt to spread communism and communist influence. The United States military countered that invasion and forced North Korean forces to retreat almost all the way to the Chinese border. Well, that was when China, now a communist country as well, intervened in support of communist North Korea. And Chinese troops entered on North Korea's side, and a stalemate emerged around the 38th parallel, which roughly equates to the border between North and South Korea today. After 3 years of undeclared war, in 1953, an armistice was signed, restoring the pre-war status quo. But there has never been a formal peace treaty between North and South Korea, and technically the two countries are still at war today. The world was firmly divided in two: communist, anti-communist / capitalist zones of influence that covered the globe. Now, there were indeed critics of American and NATO Cold War policies during this period, but the example of Stalin's brutal dictatorship in the Soviet Union made few Cold War critics sympathetic to the cause of communism. Stalin's regime, to make a very long story short, killed or imprisoned millions who did not submit to his policies, which cast a pall over communism in general for decades and still influences many people's perceptions of communism today. Instead of this attack against the capitalist fight against communism, Cold War critics were more concerned about the potential of turning foreign policy into an ideological crusade, and they didn't want continual interventions into the affairs of other nations and felt the United States should concentrate on its own internal issues and problems. The rhetoric of the fight against fascism and the lofty ideals of things like the Four Freedoms that emerged from World War II pretty much put the final nail in the coffin of the legitimacy of geopolitical paradigms like imperialism and colonialism. And many wanted Truman and the United States to take the lead in worldwide self-government movements and continue the process of global decolonization. And to kind of lead this charge, the United States gave independence to the Philippines in 1949, which the United States had control over ever since the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898. However, faced with pressures of policies of containment and from allies like Britain and France that wanted to retain some of their colonies, which were very crucial to their economic well-being, the United States quit calling for an end to colonialism and instead focused on keeping anti-communist nations a part of the quote-unquote free world, regardless of the oppression of their own people. The United States unfortunately supported undemocratic and authoritarian regimes as long as they were not communist. And of course, the support for those sorts of regimes led to accusations of the U.S. and NATO powers being hypocrites to the value of freedom they supposedly espoused. That concludes part 1 of our Chapter 23 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.